When Alexander the Great died in Babylon in 323 BCE, the world he had conquered was thrown into chaos. This was a man who had defeated empires, marched his soldiers farther than any king before him, and left behind a realm stretching from Greece to India. His death at just 32 years old was shocking not only because it ended his meteoric rise, but also because no one had prepared for it. There was no clear heir. His generals, those hardened warriors who had followed him across deserts and mountains, now argued bitterly over who should lead. Yet behind the struggle for power lay a quieter, stranger mystery, one that would unfold over centuries. What happened to the body of Alexander the Great? For all his fame, his tomb has never been definitively located, and his remains vanished from history, leaving scholars and seekers to argue and speculate ever since. The story begins with his sudden illness. Ancient sources disagree on the details. Some say he died from fever, others from poisoning, others from exhaustion after years of relentless campaigning. Whatever the cause, Alexander collapsed after a banquet and lingered for days, unable to speak but still fully conscious. His soldiers, so devoted that they marched past him in silence to catch one last glimpse, wept as they saw their leader fading. When he finally died, Babylon filled with grief, but also with a pressing question: what to do with the body of a man who had come to be seen, not just as a king, but as a god? In the ancient world, the burial of a ruler was never just a private affair. It was a statement of legitimacy, a claim to power. Whoever buried Alexander might also claim to inherit his authority. His generals knew this, and they knew that his body would become a symbol that could unify or divide an empire already threatening to split apart. The sources tell us that Alexander's corpse was prepared with extraordinary care. His body, it was said, did not decay as expected, a detail that his followers took as proof of his divine nature. He was placed in a golden coffin, set within a magnificent carriage designed to carry him back to Macedonia, the land of his ancestors. But the journey home never happened. Somewhere along the way, the corpse was stolen. Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals, seized the body and brought it instead to Egypt. Why? Because Egypt was a land rich in symbolism, and Ptolemy, who had ambitions of ruling there, understood that possessing Alexander's remains would strengthen his claim. By burying Alexander in Egypt, he tied his own rule to the memory of his great commander. From that point forward, the body of Alexander became less a sacred relic for the Macedonian people and more a political prize in the hands of those who sought power. For centuries afterward, travelers and historians wrote of Alexander's tomb in Alexandria, the city he himself had founded. Strabo, the Greek geographer, claimed to have seen it. Roman emperors, too, are said to have visited, paying their respects to the man they revered as one of the greatest conquerors of history. Julius Caesar, when in Egypt, reportedly stopped at Alexander's tomb to honor him. Centuries later, so did Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, who is said to have placed a golden crown on Alexander's head and scattered flowers at his feet. The tomb, it seems, was not hidden in those days but celebrated, a place of pilgrimage for rulers who saw themselves as inheritors of Alexander's legacy. And yet, sometime after the 4th century CE, the trail goes cold. The tomb disappears from the historical record. Alexandria suffered earthquakes, invasions, and transformations as empires rose and fell. Temples became churches, churches became mosques, and amid the shifting sands of politics and religion, the resting place of Alexander simply vanished. Later writers speculated about its fate. Some thought it had been destroyed by Christian zealots eager to erase pagan symbols. Others believed it had been buried beneath the ever-changing streets of Alexandria, hidden but not lost. Treasure seekers and archaeologists have searched for it, but the city is layered with centuries of history, making excavation nearly impossible. The question of the body's disappearance raises more than just curiosity. It reminds us how fragile memory can be, even for the most famous figures in history. Alexander was worshipped as a living god by some of his followers. He was honored as a model by Julius Caesar, admired by Napoleon, studied by countless generals. Yet his tomb, once the center of reverence, simply slipped away. If the body of a man so revered could vanish, what does that say about the rest of history? About all the forgotten kings, queens, and emperors whose remains we no longer even see? Modern scholars and archaeologists have advanced theories. Some suggest the tomb might lie beneath modern Alexandria, buried under layers of stone and concrete. Others think it was destroyed during riots or conquests, its treasures looted, its walls reduced to rubble. A few fringe theories even imagine that the body was moved elsewhere, hidden in secrecy by followers who feared desecration. Each theory leaves us with more questions than answers, and the mystery only deepens. What makes the disappearance of Alexander's body so haunting is the contrast between his extraordinary life and the silence of his death. He crossed deserts and mountains, defeated empires, founded cities, spread Hellenistic culture across continents. He dreamed of reaching the ends of the earth, of uniting East and West under one rule. Yet when it came to his final resting place, the earth seems to have swallowed him. The conqueror who sought to leave his mark on every land has left no mark we can still see on his own grave. Even today, the search continues. Archaeologists occasionally announce new discoveries, claiming they may have found signs of Alexander's tomb. The excitement is always brief, and the evidence never conclusive. Perhaps the mystery will never be solved. Perhaps Alexander's body is destined to remain lost, just as he himself once vanished into the deserts of Central Asia, pursuing horizons no one else could reach. His missing tomb is more than a historical puzzle. It is a symbol of ambition, of the fleeting nature of power, of how even the greatest of conquerors must eventually surrender to time and obscurity. And so we are left with a question that echoes across centuries. Where does Alexander the Great truly lie? Was he buried in glory beneath Alexandria, only to be forgotten as the city changed around him? Was his coffin carried off by looters, his remains scattered and destroyed? Or is he still there, beneath streets where millions walk daily, hidden but not gone? No answer comes, and perhaps none ever will. To understand how the body of Alexander the Great could simply vanish, it is worth pausing on the role his remains played in the centuries immediately following his death. For the generals who carved up his empire, the corpse was not just a relic but a political weapon. Control of Alexander's body meant control of his memory, and in a world where divine kingship was woven into politics, his tomb had the power to legitimize rule. This is why Ptolemy, who founded the dynasty that would govern Egypt for centuries, risked everything to intercept the funeral procession. He did not allow the golden coffin to reach Macedonia, the ancestral homeland, but instead diverted it south into his new dominion. In doing so, he physically tied Alexander to Egypt and symbolically claimed the right to stand as his successor. The tomb, once established in Alexandria, became a kind of stage where power could be performed. Later Ptolemies used it to reinforce their authority, and when the Romans entered Egypt, they to recognize its importance. Writers describe how Julius Caesar, upon arriving in Alexandria during his pursuit of Pompey, visited the tomb and wept at the sight of Alexander. Caesar had long modeled himself on the Macedonian conqueror, carrying his stories with him during campaigns. To stand before the body was, in Caesar's mind, to stand before destiny itself. A few decades later, Augustus followed the same path, supposedly placing a laurel crown upon the embalmed head. According to some accounts, he accidentally broke Alexander's nose in the process. A small, almost comical detail that has nonetheless survived in the historical record, reminding us of how physical the presence of the body still was at that time. Other Roman emperors made pilgrimages to the tomb. Caligula is said to have taken Alexander's breastplate as a trophy. Septimius Severus supposedly sealed the site to protect it from further disturbance, placing it under guard. These accounts suggest that for nearly 6 centuries after Alexander's death, his tomb remained intact and accessible. a place where rulers could reaffirm their connection to the past. But it is precisely this accessibility that makes its later disappearance so puzzling. If so many knew of its location, if emperors could visit it openly, then how could it vanish so completely that by the Middle Ages no one even knew where to look? The decline of the tomb's visibility coincides with the decline of Alexandria itself. Once a thriving metropolis, home to the great library, and a center of trade and scholarship, the city endured repeated crises. Earthquakes shook its foundations. Civil wars toward its stability. The spread of Christianity transformed its cultural landscape, as pagan monuments were abandoned or destroyed. By the time Islam arrived in the 7th century, Alexandria was a shadow of its former self, and whatever remained of Alexander's tomb may already have been forgotten. Some historians argue that Christian zeal played a role, with early church leaders eager to erase shrines associated with pagan worship. If Alexander's body had become an object of reverence, it might have been targeted, dismantled, or hidden away. Yet the silence of the record after the 4th century is not a complete void. Medieval travelers occasionally wrote of rumors surrounding the lost tomb. Some claimed it lay beneath a mosque, others that it had been seen in crumbling ruins. In the 19th and 20th centuries, archaeologists searching Alexandria unearthed tombs and sarcophagi that they tentatively linked to Alexander. None of these finds, however, has ever been proven. One theory suggests that his remains were eventually moved to Constantinople, though no evidence survives. Another holds that they were hidden deliberately by followers who feared desecration, buried so deeply beneath the city that even today's excavations cannot reach them. What makes the problem particularly difficult is the nature of Alexandria itself. Built at the edge of the Nile Delta, the city has shifted and sunk over centuries. Earthquakes have submerged whole districts into the Mediterranean. Entire neighborhoods of ancient Alexandria lie underwater, preserved beneath silt and seawater. If Alexander's tomb was built near the royal quarter, it could easily now lie beneath the waves. Divers have explored the submerged ruins, uncovering temples and statues, but the coffin of Alexander remains elusive. Each discovery sparks headlines, yet the mystery endures. There is also the question of how Alexander's body was treated. Ancient writers describe it as embalmed, perhaps in the Egyptian style, preserved against decay. If true, then the remains might still exist in some form, waiting beneath stone and earth. But embalming techniques varied, and centuries of war, looting, and natural disaster could easily have destroyed any trace. The golden coffin, if it truly existed, would have tempted looters in times of crisis. Even if the bones survived, the wealth surrounding them may have been stripped away, leaving little to identify the grave. Why does this matter so much? Why, after more than 2,000 years, do people still seek Alexander's body? The answer lies in what he represents. Alexander is not just another historical figure. He has become a symbol of human ambition, of the drive to push beyond limits. His life was mythologized even while he was alive, and his legend grew larger after his death. To find his tomb would be to touch that legend directly, to stand where ancient emperors once stood, to close a chapter of history that has remained open for centuries. It is also a reminder of how fragile memory can be. The tomb was once one of the most famous in the world, visited by emperors and written about by historians. And yet, within a few generations, it was gone. Its disappearance teaches us that even the greatest monuments are vulnerable to time. Cities shift, religions change, and the earth itself swallows what once seemed eternal. If the tomb of Alexander could vanish, what else has been lost beyond recovery? How much of the past lies hidden beneath our feet? Its story is waiting, but perhaps never to be told again. In modern times, the search for Alexander's tomb has become almost an obsession. Archaeologists dig beneath the streets of Alexandria, while others skim the Mediterranean seabed. Scholars pore over ancient texts, trying to reconcile contradictory accounts. Treasure hunters dream of the day the golden coffin is uncovered. And yet, each lead collapses. Each discovery proves inconclusive. The tomb remains a ghost, hovering between myth and reality. Perhaps this is fitting. Alexander himself lived on the boundary between myth and history. His campaigns were real, but his reputation was shaped by stories that blurred fact and legend. He was said to descend from Achilles, to be the son of Zeus, to tame horses no one else could master. His death, sudden and unexplained, only added to the aura. To have his tomb vanish into the earth is in keeping with the man himself, always out of reach, always more legend than flesh. Still, the disappearance leaves an open question. Was the tomb destroyed, its stones reused, its coffin melted down, its body reduced to dust? Or does it still exist, intact and waiting, hidden beneath a city that has forgotten it? The answer remains buried, but the very act of asking keeps Alexander's memory alive. His body may be missing, but the mystery ensures he is never forgotten. And so we linger with uncertainty. The generals fought over the corpse, emperors honored it, pilgrims visited it, but today it lies beyond our grasp. Did the man who conquered the known world find rest beneath the earth of Egypt, or was his body lost to fire, flood, or human greed? The silence of the record leaves us with nothing but speculation, a puzzle that resists solution. Perhaps the truth is buried in stone and sea, or perhaps it is gone forever. When we stand at the edge of Alexander's story, it is tempting to believe that the tomb must be waiting, that one day it will be uncovered, shining through the dust of centuries. Yet the truth may be less romantic. The disappearance of his body may not be a mystery that ends with revelation, but rather one that endures precisely because it cannot be solved. In this sense, the missing corpse of Alexander the Great has become as significant as his life itself, a blank space that continues to shape the way we think about ambition, memory, and history. Throughout the centuries, different cultures have projected their own meanings onto the lost tomb. For the Romans, Alexander represented the model of imperial power, the figure every emperor sought to imitate. Visiting his body was a way of linking themselves to his legend. For Christians of the later empire, however, Alexander's worship as a god-king was deeply problematic, a symbol of pagan excess. To destroy or erase his tomb may have been an act of theological defiance, a way of asserting that no man, however great, should be venerated as divine. For Islamic scholars, Alexander lived on in a different form as Dhul-Qarnayn, a figure of the Quran sometimes linked with him. In this tradition, he became part of a story not about conquest, but about the limits of human power and the divine. Well, that directs history. In every case, his missing body allowed later generations to shape him as they wished, a canvas on which new meanings could be drawn. The modern world has added its own layers. Archaeologists search for the tomb not only out of scientific curiosity, but also because of the symbolic weight it carries. To find Alexander's remains would be to connect directly with one of history. As most famous individuals, it would be a discovery rivaling that of Tutankhamun's tomb or the Terracotta Army. Museums dream of the crowds it would draw, nations dream of the prestige it would bring, and scholars dream of the answers it could provide, not just about Alexander himself, but about the cultural exchanges of the Hellenistic age, the funerary practices of the time, and the politics of memory. Yet the more the tomb remains elusive, the more it seems to resist such ambitions, as if Alexander himself continues to outpace those who chase him. Some theories suggest we may already have seen fragments of his resting place without realizing it. In the 19th century, a sarcophagus was discovered in Sidon, carved with scenes of battle and hunting, though it is now thought to belong to another ruler. For a time, it was believed to be Alexander's. Other discoveries in Alexandria have yielded grand tombs that could have been part of the Ptolemaic necropolis each time. The announcement of a possible identification has stirred excitement, only for doubt to follow. The result is a cycle of hope and disappointment, mirroring the restless energy of Alexander himself, who never stayed in one place for long. There is a strange poetry in this uncertainty. Alexander sought to unite the known world, to erase the boundaries between cultures, to march always toward the horizon. Perhaps it is fitting that his tomb, too, should remain a horizon we cannot quite reach. In its absence, we are left not with closure, but with possibility. The missing body becomes a metaphor for ambition that exceeds limits, for dreams that are never fully realized, for the way history itself always slips beyond our grasp. The question of the missing corpse also invites us to think more broadly about the role of the dead in shaping the living. Throughout history, the remains of rulers have been central to rituals of legitimacy. The pharaohs of Egypt were buried in pyramids that declared their divine power. The kings of France were interred in the Basilica of Saint Denis, where their tombs reinforced dynastic continuity. The Ming emperors of China built vast necropolises that symbolized the permanence of their rule. To lose a body in such contexts was to lose a claim to memory, to sever the thread that connected present rulers with the authority of the past. Yet Alexander's case shows something different. The absence of his body has not erased his memory, but amplified it. The missing tomb is part of why his legend remains alive, a riddle that keeps us speaking his name. We can also reflect on the ordinary people who once visited his tomb in Alexandria. Not just emperors, but travelers, merchants, and citizens would have walked past the shrine, gazing at the embalmed conqueror. For them, the body was not just a relic of political power, but a physical link to a story larger than themselves. Imagine standing in the dimly lit chamber, looking at the golden coffin, realizing that this was the man whose armies had marched from Greece to India. For a moment, the distance between myth and reality would have collapsed. Then, centuries later, the chamber was gone, swallowed by time. The memory of those visitors, like the tomb itself, vanished, leaving us only fragments of testimony. This vanishing forces us to confront how much of history is built on absence. We piece together the past from ruins, from broken statues, from half-legible texts. The story of Alexander's missing body is simply one of the clearest examples of this process. It reminds us that history is not a complete picture but a mosaic full of gaps, and that sometimes the gaps are as meaningful as the pieces that remain. The missing tomb does not weaken Alexander's legacy, it strengthens it, allowing each generation to wonder, to imagine, to project its own questions onto the silence. In the end, what lessons can we draw from the disappearance of his remains? One is humility. Even the greatest conqueror, who reshaped the map of the ancient world, could not secure his final resting place. His empire crumbled, his generals fought, his body was moved and lost. Power, no matter how vast, is temporary. Another lesson is persistence. Though the tomb is gone, the search continues, driven by curiosity and wonder. This persistence reflects something deeply human, our refusal to let go of the past, our need to connect with those who came before us, our belief that memory matters even when the evidence slips away. And so the story ends not with discovery, but with a question. Where is Alexander the Great? Beneath the streets of Alexandria, under the sea, destroyed in riots, hidden in plain sight? We do not know, and perhaps we never will. But in asking the question, we keep alive not only his memory, but the larger truth that history is never settled, that it is always being reshaped by what we seek and what we fail to find. In the silence of his missing tomb, Alexander speaks in a different voice. He reminds us that death equalizes, that ambition fades, that even legends dissolve into mystery. But he also reminds us that memory is not bound to stone or bone. It is carried in stories, in the restless search, in the wonder of those who still look for him. The conqueror who once marched to the ends of the earth now marches endlessly through time. His missing body is symbol of the questions that will never leave us. And so we are left at the edge of the mystery, staring into the sands of Egypt, listening to the waves against the coast of Alexandria, imagining a golden coffin beneath the earth. Was he there once? Is he there still? Or has he slipped forever into the silence of history? The answer lies beyond our reach, but the question lingers, as eternal as the horizon he once pursued. Cleopatra VII, the last queen of Egypt, and Mark Antony, the Roman general who defied his own empire for love and ambition. are among the most famous figures of the ancient world. Their story has been told in plays, poems, and films for centuries. It is a tale of passion and politics of power and downfall, ending in tragedy as both took their own lives in the summer of 30 BCE, after their defeat by Octavian, the man who would become Rome's first emperor, Augustus. Yet what followed was not only the end of their lives, but also the beginning of one of history, as enduring mysteries, the disappearance of their tomb. According to ancient writers, Cleopatra and Antony were buried together in Alexandria. The Greek historian Plutarch describes how Octavian, who had triumphed over them at the Battle of Actium and then at Alexandria, allowed Cleopatra to be laid to rest beside her lover. Despite being his enemies, Octavian recognized the symbolic importance of their union in death. Their burial was meant to close a chapter, to make them relics of the past as he forged a new Roman Empire out of the ruins of their ambitions. The tomb, Plutarch tells us, was built with splendor, adorned with treasures, and designed to honor their status as rulers. But if such a tomb existed, it has never been found. For more than 2,000 years, the final resting place of Cleopatra and Antony has remained hidden. It is one of the greatest archaeological mysteries of the ancient world, a riddle that combines the allure of lost treasure, the romance of star-crossed lovers, and the political drama of Rome's rise. To imagine their tomb is to imagine not only the end of two extraordinary lives, but also the end of an entire era, the fall of the Ptolemaic dynasty that had ruled Egypt since the time of Alexander the Great, and the transformation of the Mediterranean into a Roman sea. The city of Alexandria itself complicates the search. Founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BCE, it was one of the most magnificent cities of the ancient world, a center of learning, trade, and culture. By Cleopatra's time, it had already become a jewel of the Hellenistic age, home to the Great Library, the Malchian, and the towering Pharaoh's Lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the world. But Alexandria was also a city built on fragile ground. Its coastline was unstable, subject to earthquakes and rising seas. Much of ancient Alexandria now lies underwater, submerged beneath the Mediterranean. Scholars believe that if Cleopatra's tomb was indeed in the royal quarter, near the palaces and temples where she lived, it may today lie beneath the waves, lost among the ruins beneath modern-day Alexandria. The difficulty is compounded by the lack of reliable records. Ancient writers mention the burial, but provide few details about its exact location. Was it within the city itself, in the royal district? Was it in a temple dedicated to Isis, the goddess Cleopatra closely identified herself with? Or was it in a more secluded site, away from the eyes of the conquerors who had destroyed her kingdom? Without evidence, speculation runs wild, and each theory opens new possibilities. Over the centuries, explorers and archaeologists have searched in vain. Some point to the district of Taposiris Magna, a temple complex west of Alexandria dedicated to Osiris and Isis. The temple has connection to Egyptian religious traditions has led some to believe that Cleopatra and Antony could have been buried there, in keeping with her desire to be remembered as the embodiment of Isis. In recent decades, excavations at the site have uncovered tunnels, statues, and coins bearing Cleopatra's image, fueling hopes that the tomb might still be hidden beneath its ruins. Yet so far, no definitive proof has been found. There is also the possibility that their tomb, if it once existed, was destroyed in the centuries that followed. Alexandria suffered repeated earthquakes, tsunamis, and fires that devastated its monuments. The royal quarter was particularly affected, and the buildings that once stood as symbols of Ptolemaic power may have been reduced to rubble. Long ago, later Christian and Muslim rulers of the city, indifferent or hostile to the memory of Cleopatra, may have dismantled or repurposed her tomb, leaving nothing for archaeologists to find. And yet, the idea that Cleopatra and Antony lie together in some hidden chamber continues to captivate the imagination. Their story has always been larger than life, a fusion of love and politics that transcends history. To imagine their tomb is to imagine a place where myth and reality meet. A sealed chamber containing the last queen of Egypt and the Roman general who gave up everything. For her, the allure lies not only in the possibility of discovering priceless treasures, but also in the chance to stand in the presence of two people whose lives shaped the course of history. Cleopatra herself understood the power of memory. She cultivated her image carefully, presenting herself as both a Greek monarch and an Egyptian pharaoh, as a living goddess and a shrewd politician. Her coins, her portraits, her temples all were designed to project an image of power, beauty, and divinity. It is not hard to believe that she would have planned her burial with the same care, seeking to ensure that she and Antony would be remembered not as defeated enemies of Rome, but as eternal lovers united in death. If such was her intention, then the disappearance of their tomb is doubly ironic. For while her story lives on more vividly than almost any other queen in history, her physical resting place has vanished. The tomb may still be out there, beneath the streets of Alexandria or beneath the sea, waiting for a discovery that will rewrite history. Or it may be gone forever, destroyed by time and human hands. Either way, the mystery endures. And with it the legend of Cleopatra and Antony, the lovers without a grave. When Cleopatra and Mark Antony died, the world did not simply lose to powerful figures. What disappeared with them was an entire dynasty, an ancient tradition of Egyptian rule, and a vision of independence that had lasted for centuries. Their deaths were not the quiet end of a love story, but the public spectacle of conquest, where their tomb, their memory, and their legacy became part of a larger struggle over who controlled history. To understand why their final resting place remains unknown, one must understand how Octavian, soon to be Augustus, deliberately reshaped their image and erased their monuments. Octavian's victory over Antony and Cleopatra was not just military, it was psychological. He knew the value of narrative. Rome was weary of civil wars, weary of generals fighting one another for power. To justify his own rise, Octavian needed to present Antony and Cleopatra not simply as defeated opponents, but as dangerous threats to the Roman order. And so he cast them in a specific light. Antony is a traitor seduced by an exotic queen, Cleopatra as the manipulative foreign temptress who dared to challenge Rome. Their story, as retold by Roman writers, became one of decadence, corruption, and betrayal. This portrayal was no accident. Octavian, through propaganda, ensured that Cleopatra's memory would be forever linked with seduction and downfall. In his hands, she ceased to be a skilled ruler who navigated one of the most turbulent periods in ancient history and became instead a cautionary tale. Antony, once one of Rome's most celebrated generals, was remembered less for his victories and more for his supposed weakness. In the face of Cleopatra's charms, together, their story became the foundation for Augustus's own legitimacy. By defeating them, he had saved Rome. In this political environment, their tomb became less a monument and more a liability. It was a reminder of resistance, a reminder that Rome's triumph had come at a price. While Plutarch and other Greek historians mention that they were buried together, number Roman writers seems to have visited their tomb, celebrated it, or preserved its details. Unlike the tombs of Rome's own heroes, Cleopatra and Antony's resting place was not celebrated or honored. It was tolerated at best, ignored at worst, and possibly even deliberately obscured. This Roman silence has consequences for modern historians. Without detailed records, the exact site of their burial slips into shadow. We know that Cleopatra was granted her wish to be buried beside Antony, but where this took place remains speculation. The most common theory places the tomb somewhere within the royal quarter of Alexandria, the heart of the Ptolemaic dynasty's power. This area contained palaces, temples, and gardens, a fitting place for the final rest of Egypt's last queen. But that district now lies beneath the modern city, buried under centuries of rebuilding, its foundations shattered by earthquakes and swallowed by the sea. If Octavian intended their tomb to be forgotten, Then the natural disasters that struck Alexandria completed the task. In the centuries after their deaths, the city endured earthquakes so powerful that entire sections of the coastline collapsed into the Mediterranean. Scholars have mapped underwater ruins that reveal palaces and statues once standing on land, now submerged. If Cleopatra's tomb was among them, it may still lie beneath the waves, its chambers filled with silt, its treasures hidden in the dark. There is another layer to this mystery. Cleopatra's identity as a goddess. More than most rulers, she intertwined her life with religious symbolism. She associated herself with Isis, the Egyptian goddess of motherhood, fertility, and magic. For the Egyptians, this was not just politics, it was sacred. To bury Cleopatra was to bury a divine incarnation. Some have argued that her tomb might not have been in Alexandria at all, but instead in a temple dedicated to Isis, perhaps at Taposiris Magna, west of the city. In recent years, excavations there have uncovered coins bearing her likeness, statues of Isis, and long underground tunnels. Though no definitive discovery has been made, the site fuels speculation that Cleopatra may have chosen or been granted a burial linked to her divine role. What complicates matters further is the centuries of shifting religious power in Egypt after Rome absorbed the land. Traditional Egyptian cults continued, but with diminishing influence as Christianity rose. Pagan temples were abandoned and in many cases destroyed. If Cleopatra's tomb lay within such a temple, it might have been desecrated, repurposed, or sealed forever. The silence of history may not be an accident, but the result of deliberate erasure. An attempt to overwrite her memory in favor of a new religious and political order. Meanwhile, the cultural fascination with Cleopatra and Antony has never faded. From Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra to Hollywood films, their story has been retold endlessly. And yet, the irony remains. While their legend grows, their tomb, the place where their bodies were meant to rest together for eternity, remains unknown. The lovers who define an age exist in imagination, but not in physical memory. The earth holds their secret tightly, and the centuries have conspired to keep it. And so the mystery endures. Did their tomb sink into the sea with the ruins of Alexandria? Was it hidden in a temple of Isis, its chambers still sealed in darkness? Or was it dismantled long ago, erased by conquerors who had no use for the monuments of defeated enemies? No evidence offers a final answer. Each theory opens new questions, and each discovery only deepens the fascination. To search for Cleopatra's tomb is not only to search for a burial site, it is to search for a lost moment in history. The precise point where the Ptolemaic dynasty ended and Rome's empire began. It is to seek the place where love and politics, myth and history, ambition and defeat all converge. And perhaps that is why the mystery persists, because Cleopatra and Antony were never just people, never just rulers. They were symbols, and their tomb, whether hidden or gone, remains a symbol too. If one day their tomb is found, it will not only reveal the fate of their remains, it will illuminate the final chapter of Egypt's ancient independence, the moment when the old world gave way to the new. Until then, their story is unfinished, their final resting place still unwritten in the sands of history. The mystery of Cleopatra and Mark Antony's tomb has fascinated explorers, scholars, and dreamers for centuries. Unlike so many rulers of the ancient world, whose monuments still stand, their resting place remains hidden, silent, and elusive. It is this absence, the lack of stone, inscription, or sacred chamber that keeps their story alive in the imagination. To conclude their tale, we turn to the modern age, to the archaeologists, divers, and historians who continue to search, and to the broader meaning of why this missing tomb still matters. The city of Alexandria, where most scholars believe Cleopatra and Antony were buried, is no longer the city they knew. Over to millennia, it has been remade again and again. Roman, Byzantine, Arab, Ottoman, and modern Egyptian influences have layered one atop another, burying the past beneath new foundations. Earthquakes in the 4th and 8th centuries CE caused sections of the royal district to collapse into the sea. Today, much of Cleopatra's palace complex lies underwater, a ghostly world of broken columns, toppled sphinxes, and half-buried statues scattered across the seabed. Divers have mapped parts of this submerged city, revealing the outlines of once grand structures. Some believe her tomb may still be hidden among these ruins, sealed in a chamber waiting to be discovered. The romance of this possibility is undeniable. Imagine divers entering a sealed room beneath the Mediterranean, brushing away sand to reveal inscriptions naming Cleopatra and Antony. Imagine the discovery of sarcophagi, perhaps untouched for 2,000 years, adorned with gold and symbols of Isis. It would be one of the greatest finds in archaeological history, rivaling the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922. Yet for all the speculation, no evidence has surfaced. The sea guards its secrets, and the ruins of Alexandria resist easy exploration. In recent decades, attention has shifted to Taposiris Magna, a temple complex west of the city. Led by Dr. Kathleen Martinez, archaeologists have uncovered coins, pottery, and tunnels dating to Cleopatra's time. The temple, dedicated to Osiris and Isis, seems an appropriate place for her burial, given her devotion to the goddess. Excavations have revealed long, winding passages beneath the temple, perhaps designed as sacred burial routes. Martinez has suggested that Cleopatra and Antony might lie here, not in Alexandria itself, but in a place steeped in Egyptian religious meaning. The theory remains controversial. Many scholars doubt that Octavian would have allowed Cleopatra such an honored burial, arguing instead that her tomb, if it ever existed, may have been modest and long since destroyed. Still, the allure of Taposiris Magna captures public imagination. Each announcement of a new discovery sparks headlines. Cleopatra's tomb may have been found. Yet each time, the evidence falls short of confirmation. The coins show her image, but they are not proof of her burial. The tunnels are intriguing, but they could have served many purposes. The tomb remains hidden, tantalizingly out of reach. Why does it matter so much? Why do people still long to find the tomb of Cleopatra and Antony, when thousands of other ancient rulers lie forgotten? The answer lies in the nature of their story. Cleopatra was not only a queen, she was a symbol of defiance against Rome, a woman who held her throne in a world dominated by men, and who shaped her image with brilliance. Antony was not only a general, he was a man who gave up empire for love, a Roman who became an outsider in his own world. Together, they embody themes of power, passion, and downfall that have resonated for centuries. To find their tomb would not only satisfy historical curiosity, it would bring us face to face with the final chapter of one of history's greatest dramas. The search for their tomb is also part of a larger human desire, the wish to anchor myth in reality. Cleopatra has been immortalized in art and literature, yet the real woman often slips away behind layers of imagination. Finding her tomb would cut through the myth, offering a tangible connection to the queen herself. It would remind us that she was not merely a legend, but a living, breathing ruler who walked the palaces of Alexandria, who plotted, feared, and loved, and who ultimately chose her own death. But perhaps there is another truth hidden in the silence of history. Perhaps the very absence of their tomb is what keeps their story alive. If their burial place were known, sealed behind museum glass, perhaps the mystery would fade. But as long as it remains undiscovered, Cleopatra and Antony linger on the edge of legend. Their final rest is elusive as their ambitions. Their missing tomb is not just a historical puzzle, it is a symbol of how power, love, and memory can be both fragile and enduring. And so the search goes on. Divers continue to explore the seabed of Alexandria. Archaeologists dig deeper into the sands of Taposiris Magna. Each discovery brings hope, and each failure brings more determination. Perhaps one day the earth will give up its secret, and the world will stand in awe before the tomb of Cleopatra and Antony. Or perhaps the mystery will remain unsolved, a reminder that some parts of history resist closure. What we know is this: Cleopatra and Antony were buried together. That much is certain. Where they lie, however, remains a question without an answer. And until that answer is found, we're left with a haunting thought: the last queen of Egypt and her Roman lover, who defied empires and dreamed of glory, may still rest somewhere beneath sand or sea, waiting to be rediscovered. High in the Andes, before the arrival of the Spanish conquistadors, the Inca Empire ruled one of the largest and most sophisticated societies in the pre-Columbian world, stretching across what is today Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. The Inca Empire built vast roads, terraced mountainsides into farms, and developed an administrative system that allowed them to govern millions of people. At the heart of their world stood not only their emperor, the Sapa Inca, but also the mummies of his ancestors, dead rulers who were treated as if they were still alive. Unlike in many other civilizations, where the dead were separated from the living, the Inca made their royal mummies central to political and religious life. The bodies of former rulers were preserved carefully, dressed in fine clothes, and surrounded by treasures. They were not simply relics of the past, but active participants in governance. Priests and attendants would consult them on matters of state, presenting offerings of food and drink as if they still needed sustenance. Festivals brought the mummies into public view, where they were carried through the streets of Cusco in elaborate processions, seated on litters, and honored by the people. To the Inca, the emperors never truly died. They remained guardians and advisors, watching over their descendants. When the Spanish conquistadors, led by Francisco Pizarro, arrived in the early 16th century, they were both fascinated and horrified by this practice. To them, the mummies were pagan idols, symbols of a religion they sought to destroy. They could not understand a society that treated its dead as living beings, nor did they tolerate the influence that these mummies still held. The Spanish chroniclers describe how the royal mummies were kept in the Coricancha, the great temple of the sun in Cusco, and how the people treated them with reverence. For the Spaniards, this was both a spiritual threat and a political danger, for the presence of these mummies reinforced the legitimacy of Inca nobility and fueled resistance against colonial rule. To break this connection, the Spanish sought to seize and remove the mummies. Some were taken to Lima, where they were displayed in colonial churches as proof of conquest. Others, according to reports, were hidden by loyal Inca followers who feared their desecration. Over time, the trail of the mummies grows unclear. Some chroniclers claimed they were destroyed, burned, or left to rot. Others suggested they were hidden away in mountain caves or buried in secret, kept safe from European hands. What is certain is that by the late 16th century, the royal mummies had vanished from public life. The bodies of Inca rulers, once central to the empire's identity, disappeared into the silence of history. The loss of the Inca mummies is not only a physical mystery, but also a cultural wound. For the Inca, the dead were never gone. Their ancestors' presence was tangible, their guidance real. To remove the mummies was to sever the bond, to strip away a vital source of continuity. Spanish missionaries wrote of their efforts to destroy this tradition, calling it superstition. But in doing so, they dismantled an entire worldview. The mummies represented a link between generations, a visible reminder that power and wisdom did not end with death but carried forward into the present. Even in their absence, the memory of the mummies lingers. Stories passed down in Andean communities speak of hidden burial sites, caves sealed with stone, and chambers deep within the mountains where the rulers still rest. Archaeologists have searched for these lost mummies, hoping to find evidence of the vanished emperors. While many ordinary Inca mummies have been discovered preserved naturally in the dry highlands, or sacrificed as offerings atop mountain peaks, the royal mummies of the Sapa Incas remain missing. Their disappearance is one of the great unsolved mysteries of Andean history. The mystery is complicated by the role of the Spanish chroniclers themselves. Much of what we know about the Inca comes from their writings. Yet these were men with their own agendas, often seeking to justify conquest and conversion. They wrote of the mummies as grotesque idols, downplaying their significance and exaggerating their destruction. It is possible that some mummies were hidden successfully, but the Spaniards had no interest in recording such survival. Instead, their accounts emphasized disappearance, reinforcing the narrative of colonial triumph. Still, tantalizing clues remain in the 20th century. Researchers uncovered reports that some royal mummies were sent to Spain, displayed for European audiences as curiosities from the New World. These stories, though unconfirmed, raise the possibility that the remains of Inca emperors may still exist in museum collections, mislabeled or forgotten. Others suggest that the mummies remain in Peru, concealed in caves high in the Andes, waiting to be rediscovered. What makes the mystery so compelling is not only the fate of the bodies but the symbolism of their loss. The mummies were more than physical remains. They were the embodiment of Inca continuity. Their disappearance represents the rupture caused by conquest, the erasure of traditions, and the attempt to replace one worldview with another. Yet despite this, Andean culture survived, carrying forward memory and resilience even without the visible presence of the royal dead. And so we are left with questions. Were the mummies truly destroyed, consumed by fire and neglect? Were they hidden away, sealed in secret chambers by loyal hands determined to protect them? Or do they lie far from their homeland in a European vault, stripped of their identity, but still intact? No answer has yet been found, and the mystery endures. When the Spanish conquered the Inca Empire in the 1530s, they faced not just an army, but an entire worldview. For the Inca, the emperors never truly died. Their bodies, preserved as mummies, remained the living center of politics, ceremony, and memory. The Sapa Inca was divine in life, and in death his presence was equally powerful. This made the mummies more than relics. They were political figures capable of uniting people, legitimizing rulers, and inspiring resistance to the Spaniards. This was both incomprehensible and dangerous. Spanish chroniclers such as Juan de Betanzos, Bernam Cobo, and Garcilaso de la Vega describe how the mummies were kept in Cusco. In the Coricancha, the Golden Temple of the Sun, each royal mummy was attended by servants who dressed it, fed it symbolic meals, and spoke to it as though it were alive. In major festivals, the mummies were carried through the city in processions, seated on litters covered in fine cloth, wearing jewelry and headdresses. When Spanish priests first encountered these rituals, they saw them as idolatry. To destroy the power of the Inca elite, they had to destroy or at least neutralize their dead kings. One of the earliest Spanish acts was to seize the royal mummies. Some were confiscated and displayed in Lima, according to chroniclers, in an attempt to prove that the gods of the Andes had been defeated. They were reportedly placed in colonial churches, stripped of their gold ornaments, and shown as mere bodies rather than divine beings. The Spanish hoped this would demystify them, breaking the bond between the Inca people and their rulers. But the effect was not entirely what they intended. Many indigenous people continued to treat the mummies with reverence, visiting them in secret, leaving offerings, and whispering prayers. This persistence worried the colonial authorities. The mummies were not just bones, they were symbols of resistance. They represented a political alternative, a reminder that the Inca had ruled long before the Spaniards came. So colonial priests launched campaigns to destroy them. In the mid-16th century, the Archbishop of Lima ordered the mummies removed from the churches and hidden from public view. Some accounts claim they were burned, reduced to ash in acts of deliberate desecration. Others insist they were buried in secret by Spaniards who wanted to avoid scandal, or even by indigenous caretakers who sought to protect them from destruction. Here the mystery deepens. If the mummies were destroyed, no record survives of when or how. Chroniclers disagree. Some wrote that by the late 1500s, the mummies were no longer seen, implying they had been eliminated. Others left hints that they still existed but were concealed. Garcilaso de la Vega, himself the son of a Spanish conquistador and an Inca noblewoman, wrote in the early 17th century that the mummies of several emperors had been kept intact until his time, before being suddenly removed. His account suggests secrecy, not annihilation. Modern scholars have searched archives and archaeological sites for traces of the lost rulers. In the 20th century, reports surfaced that Spanish officials may have shipped some of the mummies to Europe, where they were displayed as curiosities in palaces or collections. There are records of indigenous remains sent to Spain, though whether they were royal mummies is uncertain. If true, it raises the possibility that the bodies of Inca emperors could still exist in European vaults or museums, mislabeled or forgotten. Meanwhile, legends in Peru tell a different story. Andean oral traditions speak of the mummies being hidden in caves high in the mountains, sealed away to protect them from desecration. Local folklore often describes sacred places, springs, peaks, or stone chambers where treasures and ancestors lie hidden. For many communities, the belief persists that the royal mummies were not destroyed, but simply concealed, waiting for a time when they might return. Archaeological discoveries give weight to these traditions. While the royal mummies remain missing, countless ordinary Inca and pre-Inca mummies have been found across the Andes, preserved naturally by the cold, dry climate. The famous ice maidens, children sacrificed on mountaintops, remain intact after centuries. If common offerings could survive, then so could the carefully prepared bodies of emperors. The absence of the royal mummies, then, may not mean their destruction, but their concealment. The disappearance also had a psychological purpose. The Spaniards understood that by removing the mummies, they removed a source of unity for the Inca people. Without the visible presence of their ancestors, Inca nobles lost legitimacy, and their power faded more quickly. The Spanish chroniclers sometimes gloated over this outcome, seeing it as proof of Christianity's triumph. Yet even in their writings, traces of unease remain. They recognized that the mummies had been powerful, that even lifeless bodies could inspire loyalty and defiance. What lingers today is a puzzle with no clear solution. Were the mummies destroyed by fire? Were they hidden in mountain caves by loyal caretakers? Were they shipped to Spain and lost in European collections? Each possibility remains open. Scholars search archives for overlooked records, while archaeologists continue to dig in hopes of finding sealed chambers in Cusco or the Andes. But as with many mysteries of conquest, the truth may lie beyond reach, buried not only in earth but in silence. The story of the missing Inca mummies reminds us of how conquest reshapes memory. The Spaniards sought to erase, to replace one worldview with another. Yet the very absence of the mummies keeps their story alive. They endure not as visible bodies but as legends, as questions that refuse to be answered. In that way, they remain present ghosts of emperors who once ruled the Andes, and who, even in absence, resist forgetting. And so we ask, if the mummies of the Inca emperors were never destroyed, where do they lie? Are they sealed in caves, waiting for discovery? Are they hidden in European vaults, stripped of their identity, but still intact? Or are they gone forever, reduced to ash by those who sought to erase their power? The answers remain elusive, leaving us with a silence as heavy as the mountains themselves. The disappearance of the Inca royal mummies is not merely a question of archaeology. It is a question of cultural identity and survival. In the centuries since the conquest, generations of Peruvians have carried fragments of memory about the emperor's bodies, even if the Spanish chroniclers describe them with disdain. For indigenous communities, they remain symbols of continuity. The mystery of where they lie today continues to provoke speculation, research, and quiet reverence. In the modern era, scholars have searched archives with growing intensity, piecing together the scattered notes of Spanish administrators, priests, and travelers. A Jesuit letter from the early 1600s, for example, describes with irritation how people continued to worship mummies even after they had supposedly been removed. Another colonial document hints at royal remains being taken to Lima and hidden in storage. Though the location is never specified, These scraps suggest that the mummies did not simply vanish all at once. Instead, they passed from hand to hand, shifting from temples to churches, from colonial buildings to hidden caches, until their trail went cold. In the 20th century, renewed archaeological interest gave rise to a wave of expeditions in the Andes. The discovery of frozen child sacrifices on mountaintops, most famously the Ice Maiden on Mount Amparo in 1995, showed how remarkably well Inca bodies could be preserved. The maiden's clothing, skin, and hair remain intact after centuries, offering scientists a direct glimpse into Inca ritual. If a young sacrificial victim could endure time so perfectly, then the carefully embalmed and ritually maintained bodies of emperors might also remain, sealed away in forgotten chambers or caves. This realization reignited the search, yet archaeology is not only about digging. It also involves listening. Local oral traditions in Cusco and surrounding highland villages speak of hidden places where ancestors sleep. Some elders tell of caves sealed with stone slabs, high in the Apis, the sacred mountains that house treasures and bodies alike. For many Andean people, these are not legends but truths woven into community identity. Outsiders may interpret them as folklore, but for the descendants of the Inca, they are part of a living relationship with the land. Each mountain could hold not only sacred spirits, but the bodies of kings who never truly left. Still, scientific expeditions have limits. The Andes are vast, rugged, and filled with countless unexplored caves. Even if a chamber were found, political and ethical questions would follow. Should royal mummies, if discovered, be placed in museums for study? Should they be returned to indigenous communities for reburial or ritual care? The debate echoes other global controversies over human remains, from Egyptian mummies in European museums to Native American ancestors repatriated from collections. The Inca emperors, if rediscovered, would sit at the center of one of history's most charged cultural debates. At the same time, there are persistent rumors of European involvement. A handful of reports claim that in the 16th and 17th centuries, Spanish officials sent some mummies across the Atlantic. Natural history collections in Spain and Italy once included Andean artifacts. Though documentation is sparse, some speculate that Inca mummies could still exist in the basements of European museums, mislabeled or neglected. In the 1800s, when European explorers encountered Inca and pre-Inca mummies, they often transported them abroad without record. Could one of these unidentified bodies be a Sapa Inca himself? Without firm evidence, the possibility lingers as an unsettling thought. Beyond physical searches, the mummies also persist in the realm of symbolism to indigenous Peruvians. The lost emperors embody more than lost bones. They represent a time before conquest, when their ancestors ruled the Andes with authority and spiritual power. Even in their absence, the mummies continue to serve as a reminder that history cannot be erased so easily. The Spaniards may have tried to burn, bury, or confiscate them, but the very act of erasure gave rise to memory that refuses to die. In this way, the mummies live on, not as visible figures, but as invisible presences haunting Peru's cultural landscape. Anthropologists have noted that absence itself can be powerful. A vanished body creates a mystery, a silence that demands filling. For the Inca mummies, that silence has been filled with questions, legends, and theories. Their disappearance may have weakened the political authority of Inca nobles in the 16th century, but in the long term, it gave rise to an enduring enigma, one that continues to capture imaginations centuries later. Sometimes absence, paradoxically, can be a form of presence. The story also reflects a broader truth about conquest. When empires fall, conquerors often destroy not just armies but symbols. Statues are toppled, temples are burned, graves are plundered. But the destruction is never total. Fragments survive, memories persist, and questions remain. The Inca emperors may be gone from view, but their mystery is stronger than the clarity of an intact tomb. In fact, it is their very absence that ensures they are never forgotten. In recent years, some scholars have suggested that the Inca mummies if discovered, should not be displayed at all. Instead, they argue, they should be honored according to Andean traditions, perhaps even returned to secrecy. After all, for the Inca, the mummies were not corpses but ancestors still participating in life. To place them in glass cases would be to repeat the violence of conquest, reducing them to objects of curiosity. Better, some argue, to let them remain hidden, preserved by mystery rather than by science. And so the mystery endures. Somewhere in the Andes, or perhaps in Europe, the bodies of the Inca emperors may still exist. Or perhaps they truly were burned to ash, their remains scattered centuries ago. No evidence has yet resolved the question. All that remains is the silence, the whispers of tradition, and the stubborn survival of memory. In the end, the missing mummies remind us of the fragility of history itself. What we know is always incomplete. What we believe may rest on fragments, rumors, and silence. And yet even silence has power. The Inca emperors are not visible, but they are not gone. They live in the questions we still ask, in the legends that still circulate, and in the mountains that still guard their secrets. So we return to the enduring question: if the royal mummies were indeed hidden and preserved, would it be better to uncover them or to leave them in peace, protected by the very silence that has kept them safe for centuries? In the middle of the 5th century, Europe trembled at the mere mention of Attila the Hun. His campaign stretched across the Roman Empire, from the Balkans to Gaul, leaving entire cities abandoned and populations scattered. Roman chroniclers called him the Scourge of God, a man whose armies swept through lands like fire through dry grass. Yet for all the fear his name inspired, the final chapter of his story is marked not by triumph or battle, but by silence and disappearance. When Attila died in 453 CE, his body was buried in a manner so secretive that no one can say with certainty where it rests. Today, his missing grave has become one of history's most enduring enigmas. The story begins, oddly enough, not with a battlefield, but with a wedding. After decades of conquest, Attila prepared to marry yet another wife, a young woman named Aldico, possibly of Germanic origin. The marriage was both personal and political, as many of his unions were, cementing alliances and expanding his influence. On the night of the celebration, after feasting and drinking heavily, Attila retired with his bride. By morning, he was found dead. Accounts vary. Some chroniclers say he suffered a nosebleed in his sleep, choking on his own blood after drinking to excess. Others suggest poison or even assassination, though such claims may have been later inventions. What matters is that the mighty conqueror, feared by Rome and revered by his warriors, was suddenly gone. His death created a crisis for the Huns. Attila was more than a leader, he was the embodiment of their strength, their charisma, their claim to power. The burial of his body, therefore, had to reflect not only his personal importance, but also the needs of a fragile empire on the verge of fracture. According to the historian Jordanes, writing a century later, the funeral was a carefully orchestrated act of both honor and secrecy. Attila's people placed his body in 3 coffins, the first of gold, the second of silver, and the third of iron. Gold symbolized his wealth, silver his power, and iron his strength in war. Together, these layers represented the totality of his reign, a king who commanded riches, authority, and military might. But the most extraordinary part of the funeral came after the burial. Jordanes tells us that the grave was hidden by diverting a river. The Huns supposedly dammed the flow, dug a tomb in the riverbed, placed Attila's coffins within, and then released the waters, covering the grave forever to ensure secrecy. The laborers who carried out the work were executed, leaving no living witnesses to reveal the location. This act of concealment was both practical and symbolic. By hiding Attila's body beneath the river, the Huns protected it from desecration by enemies, while also placing him in a timeless, unreachable realm, sealed beneath nature itself. Yet Jordanes wrote 100 years after the fact, and his account mixes history with legend. Did the Huns truly bury their king under a river? Or was this a dramatic invention meant to emphasize their fierceness and mystery? Some modern historians suggest that the story reflects an old Eurasian tradition of concealing rulers' graves in inaccessible places. The Scythians, centuries before, had buried their kings in hidden mounds, guarded by secrecy and ritual. The Mongols, centuries after, would do something similar with Genghis Khan, whose tomb also vanished from history. For nomadic empires like the Huns, secrecy was not unusual, it was essential. The uncertainty of Attila's grave grew with time. No later chroniclers claim to have seen it. No archaeological evidence has ever been found. In Hungary, Romania, and other regions once under Hun control, local legends arose. Villagers told of hidden tombs, of rivers that once flowed differently, of treasures buried beneath the earth. In some places, natural mounds or ancient ruins were attributed to Attila, though none have been verified. The Danube, Tisza, and other rivers all became candidates for his watery grave. Each generation speculated, but none could prove. The disappearance of Attila's body had consequences beyond mystery. His death marked the fragmentation of the Hunnic Empire. Without his commanding presence, rival sons and generals fought for dominance. Within a few years, the empire that had once shaken Rome collapsed, scattering its people across Europe. It was as if the disappearance of the man was mirrored by the disappearance of his empire, both swallowed by history with astonishing speed. And so Attila the Hun, who had terrified the Roman world, ended not in glory, but in silence. His enemies rejoiced at his passing. His people mourned him in secrecy. His grave, if it exists at all, lies concealed, perhaps beneath the flow of a forgotten river, perhaps in some unmarked burial mound. The absence itself has become part of his legend, for a man who embodied mystery and fear. What could be more fitting than a grave no one can find? But the question remains, was Attila's body truly placed beneath a river, sealed forever by water and earth? Or was the story exaggerated by later chroniclers to add drama to his death? Could his tomb, if discovered, still hold the gold, silver, and iron coffins described by Jordanes, or would it reveal something entirely different? The silence of history leaves us suspended between myth and possibility. The death of Attila in 453 CE left behind not only a political vacuum, but also a mystery that has refused to settle. His body, hidden by his people with rituals of secrecy, became the subject of endless speculation. Over the centuries, historians, archaeologists, and even treasure hunters have asked the same question. Where lies the scourge of God? The silence of evidence has only encouraged the imagination, and so a forest of legends has grown around his burial. In the lands once ruled by the Huns stretching from Hungary to the Balkans, folk tales developed that linked Attila's name to specific rivers and landscapes. Some villagers swore that his tomb was beneath the Tisza River, one of the great waterways of the Hungarian plain. Others claimed the Danube concealed him, its broad current forever guarding the conqueror's remains. In Transylvania, legends spoke of golden coffins beneath the Maros River. Each river, in turn, became a candidate, each bend or flood an echo of the ancient funeral. These stories reflected not only local memory, but also the enduring awe that Attila inspired long after his empire collapsed. In some tales, the burial itself was embellished beyond Jordanes' account. Storytellers described Attila's tomb as filled with immense treasure, jewels, weapons, and ornaments of gold, gathered from his campaigns against Rome. They imagined chambers guarded by curses, designed to punish anyone who disturbed the king's rest. Others suggested that the river burial was a decoy, and that the real grave was hidden in a mound, guarded by magic or sealed with iron doors. The mixture of history and fantasy is typical of oral tradition, where the absence of facts invites invention. By the medieval period, Attila's grave had become a subject of fascination not only for locals but also for chroniclers. Across Europe, some monks wrote that his body had been transported to a secret valley in the Carpathians, inaccessible to outsiders. Others believed that his followers deliberately destroyed any trace of the burial, ensuring that he would remain unfindable. The fascination with his grave mirrored the fascination with his life. Attila was remembered both as a terror and as a figure of almost supernatural charisma, a man too large for ordinary history. In modern times, archaeology has sought to pierce the mystery. Excavations in Hungary and Romania have uncovered evidence of Hunnic settlement pottery, weapons, ornaments, but never the grave of Attila. Historians note that nomadic peoples often left few monumental tombs, preferring hidden burials, unlike the Egyptians, who built pyramids to announce their ruler's power. The Huns valued secrecy, mobility, and transience. To expect a grand tomb may be to misunderstand their culture. Still, the legend of the golden and silver coffins makes the search irresistible. One of the most persistent theories points to the Tisza River. Scholars note that the river has changed its course many times over the centuries. If Attila was indeed buried in its bed, then floods, erosion, and sediment would have shifted his resting place far from its original location. Archaeologists have proposed that even if coffins of gold and silver lay beneath the river centuries ago, the constant motion of water and soil would have buried them under layers of silt deep, to recover without massive excavation. The idea of a tomb literally washed away into the earth gives the mystery an added sense of inevitability. Even if it existed, time itself has swallowed it. Other scholars have turned to geology for clues. Could the Huns really have diverted a river in the 5th century? Some say yes, nomadic peoples were skilled at controlling landscapes, and with enough manpower, they could have dammed a small branch or tributary. Others argue that Jordanes' description was exaggerated, intended more as a poetic image of concealment than a literal account. Perhaps the river burial was symbolic, a way of saying that Attila had been taken by the forces of nature, absorbed into the eternal flow of the earth. A further theory is that Attila was not buried in a river at all, but in a secret chamber or mound somewhere in Hungary. Archaeologists point to the Great Hungarian Plain, where hundreds of burial mounds dot the landscape, many dating back to Scythian, Sarmatian, and early nomadic cultures. Some of these mounds have never been excavated, either because of their size or because they are now under towns, farmland, or protected land. Could Attila rest in one of these? The idea is tempting, though without direct evidence it remains speculation. The search for Attila's grave has even drawn treasure hunters. In the 18th and 19th centuries, rumors of golden coffins inspired expeditions along the Tisza and Danube. Amateur diggers scoured riverbanks, believing they might stumble upon buried treasure. None succeeded, but their efforts kept the legend alive. In the 20th century, more systematic archaeological surveys were attempted, often with no results. Each failure only deepened the sense of mystery, reinforcing the idea that Attila's grave is meant to remain hidden. The absence of discovery has also fed conspiracy-like theories. Some suggest that the grave has already been found, but deliberately concealed, either by local authorities unwilling to reveal treasures, or by governments hoping to avoid international disputes. Others imagine that the coffins of gold and silver were plundered long ago by those who knew their location, leaving behind only bones scattered or reburied in obscurity. These ideas, though speculative, thrive precisely because no evidence has been found to contradict them. The fascination with Attila's missing grave tells us something deeper about human memory. We are drawn to mysteries not because they are solvable, but because they resist solution. Attila's grave is compelling precisely because it is absent. His life was one of visible conquest, but his death vanished into silence. This tension between presence and absence mirrors the fate of his empire, overwhelming in its time, yet gone within a generation. What remains is not a monument, but a question. And so we are left with competing images. On one hand, a riverbed tomb of gold, silver, and iron sealed forever beneath moving waters. On the other, a hidden mound on the Hungarian plain, waiting for spades to uncover its secret. On yet another, the grim possibility that Attila's grave was looted centuries ago, leaving nothing but whispers. None of these can be confirmed, and so all remain possible. Which raises the haunting question: if Attila's grave is ever discovered, would it end the mystery or would it only deepen it? Would the coffins of gold and silver really lie waiting? Or would we find something far more ordinary? Perhaps the real story is not in the discovery, but in the enduring power of absence itself. When Attila the Hun died suddenly in 453 CE, his people honored him with secrecy, hiding his body in a manner that has baffled historians ever since. Yet the fate of the Huns after his death is as much a part of the mystery as the grave itself. For the empire he built did not long survive without him, and in its dissolution, the secret of his burial was swallowed along with the identity of his people. The Huns had risen from the Eurasian steppes, sweeping westward in waves of mounted warriors who struck fear into the heart of Rome. Their power was not based on cities or fortresses, but on mobility, speed, and the charisma of their leader. Attila held together a confederation of tribes: Huns, Goths, Alans, and others through his sheer force of will and his ability to command loyalty. His death broke the fragile balance. Within a year, his sons were already at war with one another, each claiming the mantle of leadership. The Battle of Nidau in 454 CE was the turning point. The Huns were defeated by a coalition of Germanic tribes, their empire fractured, and their people dispersed in the space of a single generation. The fearsome empire that had once shaken Rome vanished from the map. It is no coincidence that Attila's grave, like his empire, disappeared. The loss of a central figure left his people unable to protect, or even remember the precise location of his burial. If the laborers who dug his tomb were truly executed, then perhaps no one survived who could later point to the site. If his body was hidden beneath a river, the constant shifting of waters would have erased all trace within years. His sons, distracted by civil war and defeat, had no time to preserve the memory of his grave. Thus, absence became permanent. For the Romans, the disappearance of Attila's body was more than a mystery, it was a relief. His sudden death had spared them further invasions. His hidden grave meant they could not desecrate his body, but it also deprived his people of a visible rallying point. Unlike Alexander the Great, whose tomb became a site of pilgrimage, Attila left behind no shrine, no monument, no bones to worship or venerate. His absence weakened his memory in the political sense, even as it heightened it in the legendary sense. The conqueror who had terrified Rome simply melted into myth in the centuries that followed. Attila's name was remembered in different ways. To some, especially in Western Europe, he remained a symbol of barbarism, the scourge who nearly destroyed civilization. Medieval chronicles painted him as an almost apocalyptic figure, sent by God to punish the sins of Rome. In Hungary, however, he was sometimes remembered more favorably, even claimed as an ancestral hero. Hungarian folklore spoke of Attila as a founding figure, his lineage tied to the origins of the Magyars, though historically this connection was tenuous. In both fear and reverence, his missing grave added weight to the legend. A hidden tomb suggested mystery, perhaps even immortality. In modern times, the mystery continues to capture imagination. Historians analyze Jordan's account, archaeologists survey the Hungarian plain, and treasure hunters still whisper of coffins of gold and silver. Each attempt to solve the riddle only reinforces the sense of enigma. The grave has become not just a historical question, but a cultural symbol. It represents the fragility of empires, the limits of memory, and the way legends form when facts disappear. The absence of Attila's grave also shapes how we think about him. Unlike Julius Caesar, who left behind writings, or Charlemagne, whose tomb remains known, Attila is remembered almost entirely through the eyes of his enemies and the shadows of rumor. The silence of his grave mirrors the silence of his people, who faded into the fabric of Europe without leaving cities or monuments. In this sense, the missing body is not just an accident of history, but a reflection of the Hunnic world itself. A world of mobility, secrecy, and disappearance, and yet the fascination endures. Each time a river shifts in Hungary, each time an ancient mound is examined. The question arises, could Attila lie here? The absence of evidence is itself a presence, reminding us that not all mysteries yield answers. Some graves are meant to remain hidden, their silence louder than discovery. So the story of Attila ends as it began, in awe and fear, and in absence. The man who had threatened Rome with destruction was swallowed by a river, by soil, or perhaps by time itself. His empire vanished, his people scattered, his grave lost. What remains is the legend of a conqueror whose body no one can find. And perhaps that is fitting, for Attila was never meant to be remembered in stone or shrine. He was a force of movement, a storm across Europe, a shadow that left fear in its wake. To search for his bones is to miss the point. His power lay in his absence, in the way his name could terrify without a monument. Even in death, he defies us, reminding us that some figures are remembered not for where they lie, but for the silence they leave behind. And so we are left with a final thought. If Attila's grave were ever discovered, would it diminish him, making him ordinary, mortal, and finite? Or does his missing tomb ensure that he will forever remain larger than life? A conqueror who belongs to legend rather than to the earth. In the heart of early medieval England, at a time when kingdoms were fragile and invasions constant, a single ruler emerged who would later be remembered as the Great. His name was Alfred, King of Wessex, and his reign in the late 9th century marked a turning point in English history. Unlike Attila the Hun, whose grave was lost because of deliberate secrecy, Alfred's coffin disappeared because of centuries of upheaval, neglect, and the slow erosion of memory. The story of his vanish remains is less about one dramatic moment, and more about the gradual fading of a legacy through the shifting tides of English history. Alfred the Great was born in 849 CE at Wantage in Berkshire. He was the youngest son of King Thelwulf of Wessex, and few expected him to rule. Yet fate placed him at the center of England's survival. When Alfred came to power in 871 CE, Viking invasions were tearing through Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Most fell under the control of the Norsemen, but Alfred resisted. Through resilience and reform, he secured victories that preserved a fragment of independent England. His defense of Wessex ensured that English culture, language, and identity were not erased. For this, later generations remembered him not only as a king, but as the defender of England itself. Alfred's achievements were not limited to battle. He was deeply concerned with learning and law. At a time when literacy among rulers was rare, he promoted translations of Latin texts into Old English, ensuring that knowledge was preserved for his people. He issued legal codes that blended traditional custom with Christian principles. He founded schools, rebuilt towns, and laid the groundwork for governance that would echo for centuries. His reign was a combination of resilience in war and vision in peace. When Alfred died in 899 CE, he was buried with honor. His first resting place was in the Old Minster of Winchester, the capital of Wessex. The cathedral was the spiritual heart of the kingdom, and placing Alfred there reflected his importance. For a time, his remains were safe, revered by those who saw him as the savior of England. Yet history rarely allows permanence as dynasties shifted and churches expanded. Alfred's body was moved around 1110. It was transferred to the newly built Hyde Abbey, just outside Winchester. There, a great church and monastery were constructed, and Alfred's coffin was placed near the high altar alongside those of his wife Elswith and his son Edward the Elder. For several centuries, Hyde Abbey stood as a place of devotion and memory. Pilgrims came to honor Alfred, the king who had fought the Vikings and defended Christendom. His grave was not hidden, or secretive, was celebrated, marked by monuments that declared his greatness. But monuments, like kingdoms, are fragile. In the 16th century, King Henry VIII ordered the dissolution of the monasteries, destroying abbeys and seizing their wealth. In 1538, Hyde Abbey was torn down. Its stones were taken for other buildings, and its church reduced to rubble. In the process, the graves of Alfred and his family were desecrated, Accounts from the time suggest that Alfred's coffin was broken open, its bones scattered. Some say the remains were thrown aside with little care, treated as common rubble in the rush to strip the abbey of value. Others believe that local townspeople tried to preserve them, burying fragments of the royal remains in secret nearby. Still others hold that the bones were carried away by builders, discarded without recognition. What is certain is that after 1538, the exact resting place of King Alfred was lost. In the centuries that followed, Winchester grew and modernized, but the memory of Alfred lingered. Antiquarians in the 18th and 19th centuries tried to trace his remains. Some claimed that bones, unearthed in gardens near the abbey ruins, were Alfred's. In 1866, workmen digging in the area discovered a set of stone coffins. Excitement ran high, but the finds were mishandled and reburied without proper examination. Each attempt to locate Alfred's coffin seemed to end in uncertainty. The mystery deepened in the 20th and 21st centuries. Archaeologists revisited the site, using modern techniques to examine the soil. In 2014, researchers studied a set of bones long kept at Winchester Museum, believed by some to belong to Alfred. DNA testing and radiocarbon dating, however, revealed they were from centuries later, not the 9th century. The conclusion was bitter. Alfred's body was almost certainly destroyed. During the dissolution of the monasteries, his coffin broken and scattered beyond recovery. Yet, like Attila, the absence of Alfred's grave carries meaning. His physical remains may be gone, but his legacy is larger than bones. Alfred the Great lives on in the survival of English culture, the endurance of the English language, and the very idea of England itself. A missing coffin cannot erase his achievements, nor can scattered bones diminish the memory of the king who stood firm against invasion. And so we are left with an unresolved question. In a modern world where science can trace DNA across centuries, where archaeologists can skim beneath the earth, might Alfred's remains one day be identified? Could a fragment of bone, hidden in an unmarked grave, still tell us something about the man who defended England 1,000 years ago? Or is the absence of his coffin itself part of his story? A reminder that even kings can be lost to time? When Alfred's coffin was torn from its honored place during the dissolution of the monasteries in the 16th century, his legacy suffered an indignity that echoed through the centuries. For a man whose reign was marked by resilience and order, his posthumous fate was one of disorder and loss. Yet the search for Alfred's remains has been relentless, spanning generations of antiquarians, archaeologists, and historians, each hoping to solve a mystery that seems to recede the closer one comes to the truth. The earliest accounts after the abbey's destruction suggest a scene of chaos. Hyde Abbey, like many monastic sites under Henry VIII's command, was stripped bare. Gold and silver were seized, stones dismantled, relics scattered. Amid this dismantling, the royal graves became obstacles rather than treasures. In the rush to repurpose the land, Alfred's coffin and those of his kin were said to have been broken apart. Some witnesses reported that the coffins were of lead and stone, containing bones that were cast aside. Others claimed that the remains were treated with slightly more care, reburied hastily in the earth without markers. Whatever the truth, no record clearly identified their new location. The silence of documentation has left centuries of doubt. In the 18th century, when curiosity about England's medieval past began to grow, antiquarians turned their attention to the ruins of Hyde Abbey. A housing development had risen over the site, its gardens and lanes overlaying the once grand monastery. When bones were unearthed in the 1780s during building work, excitement surged. Local accounts claimed that 3 coffins were found, possibly those of Alfred, his wife Elswith, and his son Edward, the elder. Yet, in an era before careful excavation, the remains were treated casually. Workmen discarded bones, moved stones, and reburied fragments without records. By the time scholars arrived, the evidence was gone. The 19th century brought renewed enthusiasm. England was forging a national identity rooted in its medieval kings, and Alfred was hailed as the father of the English nation. Statues were erected in his honor, most famously the great bronze figure in Winchester unveiled in 1901. But while monuments rose above ground, beneath it Alfred's coffin remained missing. Excavations near Hyde Abbey revealed fragments of stone sarcophagi and bones, but none could be definitively linked to the king. The problem was not only lack of care in earlier centuries, but the simple fact that Hyde Abbey's ruins had been disturbed countless times. Blurring the archaeological record, the 20th century added science to the search. In the 1960s and again in the 1990s, archaeologists surveyed the Hyde Abbey site with greater precision. They mapped the layout of the abbey and identified where the high altar had stood, the place where Alfred's coffin would most likely have been placed. Yet centuries of construction, demolition, and repurposing had layered soil and debris over the graves. Each trench opened revealed bones, but not Alfred's with certainty. Some were medieval monks, others ordinary townsfolk. The royal coffin, if it survived, seemed elusive then. In the early 21st century, advances in DNA and radiocarbon dating reignited hope. The discovery of Richard III's remains in 2012, buried beneath a Leicester car park, proved that lost kings could indeed be found. Alfred became the next target of possibility. In 2014, researchers tested bones long kept in Winchester Museum, thought to be linked to Hyde Abbey. The announcement caused a stir. Perhaps England's greatest king had finally been located, yet the results were disappointing. The bones, though ancient, dated from several centuries after Alfred's time. Once again, the trail went cold. This cycle of hope and disappointment has characterized the search for Alfred's coffin. Each discovery seems to bring him closer, only for science to draw him away again. Some historians argue that Alfred's body was so thoroughly destroyed during the Abbey's demolition that no identifiable remains could possibly survive. Others believe that fragments still lie beneath gardens and houses in Winchester, waiting to be uncovered by future excavations. Still others suggest that bones removed and reburied in churchyards in the 18th century may yet contain the king's remains, hidden among unmarked graves. What makes Alfred's missing coffin more than a matter of archaeology is the symbolic weight it carries. To find Alfred would be to link modern England directly to its survival moment. When Viking conquest nearly ended Anglo-Saxon rule, it would be to connect the myths of the great king with physical reality. The desire to recover him is not only about history, but about identity and urge to anchor English culture in a tangible, ancestral figure. This explains why each report of bones or coffins near Winchester stirs the public imagination. Alfred is not just any king, he is the king who preserved England itself. Yet perhaps the very absence of his remains contributes to his greatness. Without a coffin to fix him in one place, Alfred has become a symbol that transcends location. His legacy lives in language, law, and the memory of resistance. Unlike kings whose tombs are displayed in cathedrals, Alfred is remembered in schools, monuments, a national myth. He belongs to England as a whole, not to a grave. Still, the human urge to find him remains. Archaeologists continue to examine Hyde Abbey's ruins with new technologies. Ground-penetrating radar and soil analysis may one day reveal what centuries of digging could not. DNA testing of royal descendants could provide a key. Should any bones be recovered from the right period? The question hangs in the air. Is Alfred truly lost forever? Or does the earth still hold him in secret, waiting for the right moment to return him to history? And so we arrive at a lingering thought. If Alfred the Great's coffin were finally uncovered, would it change the way we see him? Would the man who defended England become more real, more human? Or would the fragile remains only remind us of mortality? Or does the uncertainty of this absence, this space where memory and mystery intertwine, preserve his legend better than any coffin ever could? The disappearance of Alfred the Great's coffin is not just a story of scattered bones and demolished abbeys. It is a meditation on how history remembers greatness even when physical evidence is gone. For centuries, England has honored Alfred not by his tomb, but by his memory, woven into law, culture, and the very fabric of the nation. His missing coffin forces us to ask what truly preserves a legacy. Is it stone and bone, or is it the endurance of ideas? By the 17th century, when antiquarians began their first systematic efforts to rediscover the past, Alfred's grave was already a puzzle. The old minster in Winchester had long since been demolished, Hyde Abbey razed, and the royal coffins disturbed. When scholars scoured the surviving records, they found tantalizing but incomplete hints. The chronicler John Leland, writing in the 1540s, described Hyde Abbey's royal graves as taken up and spoiled. Later accounts spoke of fragments, of coffins being found in gardens, bones scattered in pits, or reburied in nearby churchyards without markers. But nothing could be verified, each lead dissolved into rumor. What emerged over the centuries was less a trail of bones than a cultural inheritance. Alfred was claimed by historians as the founder of English monarchy, by educators as the promoter of learning, and by the common people as a symbol of survival. His greatness became a national myth, celebrated in poetry, history, and eventually bronze. The famous statue in Winchester, with its imposing sword raised to the sky, is less a likeness of Alfred than a projection of English memory. It is Alfred as imagined hero, defender, lawgiver, unifier. No coffin is needed to sustain that vision. In many ways, Alfred's missing coffin illustrates the difference between physical and cultural remembrance. The tombs of many kings can still be visited: William the Conqueror in Caen, Edward the Confessor in Westminster Abbey, Richard III now reinterred in Leicester Cathedral. These graves give weight to their legacies, grounding their lives in physical reality. Alfred, however, is remembered in absence. His coffin is gone, his bones scattered. Yet his story remains unshaken. Indeed, his very absence seems to magnify his legend, allowing him to be everywhere rather than confined to a single stone box. Modern archaeology continues to circle around the problem. In 2014, when bones from Hyde Abbey were tested and revealed to be centuries too late for Alfred, disappointment was mixed with fascination. Even in failure, the search generated headlines. The hope of discovery persists, fueled by the success of Richard III's identification. Perhaps in time, ground-penetrating radar will reveal an untouched grave beneath Winchester, or a reburied coffin will emerge in an unexpected location. Until then, Alfred's coffin remains a blank space in the historical record, a silence that forces reflection. But maybe the true meaning lies not in recovering bones, but in remembering what bones cannot tell. Alfred's greatness was never in his body, but in his ability to shape England's future. He ensured that Old English would survive Viking conquest, that law and order could be preserved in chaos, and that Christian learning would flourish even on the edge of collapse. His legacy endures in the English language, in the continuity of English monarchy, and in the survival of a nation that might otherwise have been erased. In this sense, the missing coffin is itself a lesson. Graves can be destroyed, bodies lost, abbeys torn down, but ideas, when translated, written, taught, and passed down, can outlast stone. Alfred's absence does not diminish him. If anything, it reinforces his role as a figure who transcends death. His memory unbound by a single location. He is not buried in one place, but alive in many. And yet, the question still lingers, tantalizing in its simplicity. Could Alfred's bones still lie beneath the soil of Winchester, waiting for rediscovery? Could the king who saved England be found again? His identity confirmed by DNA, his coffin restored to honor? Or is his absence the very thing that secures his immortality, forcing us to remember not the frailty of his bones, but the endurance of his legacy? The vanished coffin of Alfred the Great is, ultimately, more than an archaeological problem. It is a reminder of what is truly unbreakable in history. Stones can be shattered, abbeys torn down, and bodies scattered. But greatness survives in memory. Alfred's coffin may never be found, but Alfred the Great himself will never be forgotten. Few figures in history have captured the imagination quite like Cleopatra VII, the last queen of Ptolemaic Egypt. Her story has been retold in chronicles, poems, plays, films, and myths. She was a woman who defied expectations, politically shrewd, linguistically gifted, and determined to preserve her kingdom in a world dominated by Rome. Yet while her life is one of the most documented of the ancient world, her final resting place remains one of its most enduring mysteries. Cleopatra's missing tomb is more than an archaeological puzzle. It is a window into the transition between the ancient world and the Roman Empire, a silence at the end of a life filled with drama and power. Cleopatra was born in 69 BCE, the daughter of Ptolemy XII, a ruler from the Macedonian Greek dynasty that had governed Egypt since the conquest of Alexander the Great. Unlike many of her royal predecessors, Cleopatra embraced Egyptian identity. She was the first of her dynasty to learn the Egyptian language, even as she mastered Greek, Latin, and other tongues. This ability to move between cultures allowed her to navigate the volatile politics of the Mediterranean. Her reign began in turmoil. At only 18, she found herself co-ruler with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII. The relationship quickly collapsed into civil war, drawing in the most powerful man in the world at the time, Julius Caesar. Cleopatra's dramatic introduction to Caesar, according to legend, involved her being smuggled into his quarters wrapped in a carpet. Whatever the truth, she secured his support and regained the throne. Their alliance was political, but also personal, producing a son, Caesarion. For a brief time, Cleopatra and Caesar stood at the center of Roman and Egyptian power. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, Cleopatra aligned herself with another Roman leader, Mark Antony. Together they ruled Egypt and much of the eastern Mediterranean. In defiance of Rome's rising ruler, Octavian, their relationship, both political and romantic, has been immortalized as one of history's great love stories. But it ended in tragedy. In 31 BCE, Octavian defeated Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium. The following year, as Roman forces closed in on Alexandria, Antony fell on his sword. Cleopatra, unwilling to be paraded through Rome as a captive, chose death over humiliation. Ancient accounts describe her arranging for a poisonous snake, an asp, to be smuggled into her chamber, though some suggest poison was applied by other means. Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE marked the end of Egyptian independence. Octavian, soon to become Augustus, the first Roman emperor, annexed Egypt as his personal province. The Ptolemaic dynasty was extinguished, and with it, 3,000 years of pharaonic tradition. Yet Octavian permitted Cleopatra and Antony to be buried together. The sources agree on this point. They were laid side by side, honoring their bond even in death. But where? That question has haunted historians ever since. The most common belief is that Cleopatra and Antony were buried somewhere in or near Alexandria, the great city founded by Alexander the Great, which served as the Ptolemaic capital. Ancient writers described a tomb noble and royal prepared for them, adorned with treasures. Yet Alexandria's geography presents a problem. Much of the ancient city now lies underwater, submerged by earthquakes and rising seas over to millennia. Temples, palaces, and even parts of the royal quarter have vanished beneath the Mediterranean. If Cleopatra's tomb was located in this area, it may lie beneath the waves, entombed not only by stone, but by the sea itself. Another theory points inland to the temple complex of Taposiris Magna, west of Alexandria. Excavations there in recent decades have uncovered Ptolemaic structures, including tunnels and burial chambers. Archaeologists have suggested that Cleopatra, identifying herself with the goddess Isis, may have chosen to be buried in a sacred temple dedicated to her. Some findings, coins bearing her image, statues of Isis, have fueled speculation. Yet despite years of searching, no definitive evidence of her tomb has been found. The mystery of Cleopatra's tomb is amplified by the silence of Roman sources. Octavian may have allowed her a royal burial, but he had little interest in memorializing her. For Rome, Cleopatra was both a defeated enemy and a useful symbol. She was portrayed in propaganda as a seductress who lured Antony away from Roman virtue, a dangerous foreign queen who threatened Roman order. To elevate her memory would have undermined Augustus's narrative of triumph. Thus, the tales of her burial were suppressed, her tomb left uncelebrated. Over time, its location faded from memory. What is striking is how this absence mirrors her legacy. Cleopatra is remembered not through monuments but through stories. Her tomb, if ever found, might reveal treasures, inscriptions, or even mummified remains. But in being lost, it has become part of her myth of fitting in for a queen whose life blurred the line between politics and legend. Each generation imagined her resting place differently. A golden tomb beneath Alexandria's palaces, a sacred chamber in a desert temple, or a hidden vault beneath the sea. And so the question lingers, centuries after her death, where lies Cleopatra? The last pharaoh of Egypt, the queen who held Rome at bay. Was her tomb swallowed by the sea, concealed in a temple, or deliberately hidden by the empire that conquered her? The mystery of Cleopatra's missing tomb has stirred not only historians but also explorers, treasure hunters, and archaeologists for centuries. Unlike many ancient monarchs whose burial sites are clearly recorded, Cleopatra's resting place is an enigma mentioned only in vague terms by ancient writers and obscured by centuries of political upheaval, earthquakes, and shifting landscapes. The very absence of a definitive tomb has transformed her grave into a kind of legend, one that carries as much weight as her life itself. The search begins with Alexandria. Founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BCE, the city was built as both a Greek metropolis and a pharaonic capital. It became home to the Library of Alexandria, the pharaoh's lighthouse, and the palaces of the Ptolemies. It was here that Cleopatra ruled, and it was here that she and Mark Antony died. Ancient sources suggest they were buried with royal splendor in the city, yet no precise description of the tomb survives. The royal quarter, where such a tomb might have stood, lies beneath modern Alexandria and the Mediterranean Sea. Earthquakes in the 4th and 8th centuries CE toppled much of the shoreline into the water, carrying palaces and temples with it. Today, divers have mapped submerged ruins, but the city that Cleopatra knew is fragmented beneath layers of stone and silt. This has led some scholars to conclude that her tomb lies beneath the sea, buried among the ruins of the palace district. Yet underwater archaeology is painstaking and slow. The waters around Alexandria are cloudy, the ruins sprawling, and modern development along the coast complicates exploration. While divers have recovered statues, columns, and jewelry from the submerged city, no trace of Cleopatra's resting place has emerged. Other theories turn away from Alexandria's drowned ruins. One of the most prominent alternatives is the temple complex at Taposiris Magna, located about 30 miles west of the city. This temple, dedicated to the goddess Isis, was a significant religious center in Cleopatra's time. Archaeologists argue that Cleopatra, who consciously presented herself as the embodiment of Isis, may have chosen this temple as her final resting place, symbolically uniting herself with the goddess. Excavations at the site have uncovered coins bearing Cleopatra's image, statues of deities, and even mummies in elaborate stone sarcophagi. In 2009, reports surfaced that underground chambers had been discovered at Taposiris Magna, raising hopes of finding Cleopatra's tomb. The excitement was palpable, with international headlines declaring that the queen might soon be found, yet years of excavation yielded no definitive evidence. The coins and statues confirmed the temple's connection to Cleopatra's reign, but not her burial. Archaeologists remain divided. Some believe the temple still hides her tomb, while others dismiss the theory as unlikely, pointing out that Ptolemaic rulers were traditionally buried in Alexandria. Part of the difficulty lies in Cleopatra's political legacy to the Romans. She was not a queen to be honored, but a defeated enemy to be vilified. Octavian, later Augustus, reshaped her image in Roman propaganda, portraying her as a manipulative seductress who ensnared Antony and threatened Rome. His victory narrative required Cleopatra's memory to be tarnished, not celebrated. This may explain why her tomb was unmarked, ignored, or even deliberately obscured. Unlike the grand pyramids of earlier pharaohs, her grave had no enduring monument. Its disappearance was, perhaps, intentional. Yet the fascination with her missing tomb persists because of what it might reveal. If Cleopatra's resting place were discovered, it could reshape our understanding of her final days and her identity. Inscriptions might clarify her role as a ruler. Artifacts could reveal how she merged Egyptian and Greek traditions, and the tomb itself might symbolize the fusion of two worlds. At the edge of collapse, even the remains of Cleopatra and Antony if preserved would offer scientific insights through DNA analysis, confirming their lineage and health. But every failed search only deepens the allure. Cleopatra's tomb has become a mirror of her legacy, elusive, mysterious. Shaped as much by myth as by fact, she remains both everywhere and nowhere. Her story told through Roman accounts, Shakespearean drama, and Hollywood films. Yet her bones hidden beyond reach. Unlike the mummies of earlier pharaohs proudly displayed in museums, Cleopatra resists capture. Her absence ensures her immortality as a legend. The question lingers, as it always has. Was Cleopatra truly laid to rest in a temple, bound to Isis and death? Or does she lie beneath the waves of Alexandria, entombed forever in the drowned palaces of her ancestors? And if one day her tomb is found, will the discovery reduce her to dust and fragments? Or will it finally restore her as more than myth, a queen of flesh and bone, whose power still echoes? After 2,000 years, to speak of Cleopatra as missing tomb is to speak of the enduring tension between history and memory. More than 2,000 years have passed since her death, yet the world continues to chase her shadow. The fascination is not only with who she was, but with what she represented. The end of one of history's most powerful dynasties, the fall of Egypt as an independent kingdom, and the dawn of Roman imperial rule over the ancient Mediterranean. In this way, her lost tomb becomes less about a burial site and more about the meaning of endings themselves, political, cultural, and personal. Her reign ended in catastrophe after the defeat at Actium, when her naval forces and those of Mark Antony were crushed by Octavian's fleet. Cleopatra retreated to Alexandria. It was there that the last chapter of her life unfolded, surrounded by collapsing alliances, dwindling resources, and the advancing armies of Rome. She chose not to be paraded as a captive in Octavian's triumph. Instead, according to tradition, she arranged her own death, most famously by the bite of an asp. Modern historians doubt the literal snake story, suggesting instead that she may have ingested a fast-acting poison. Whatever the method, her death was both an act of defiance and a calculated performance, the final gesture of a queen who knew the power of symbols. After her death, Octavian allowed her and Antony to be buried together with royal honors, at least according to the historian Plutarch. But what did royal honors mean to the Romans who had just annihilated her dynasty? To Cleopatra, it might have meant a gilded tomb, eternal rights, and a lasting monument. To Octavian, it meant little more than ensuring her body was placed out of sight. Her story rewritten by his propagandists for the Romans. Cleopatra became a cautionary tale of foreign decadence, a symbol of Eastern excess that had nearly corrupted Rome itself over time. Her grave ceased to matter to those who held power. The Ptolemaic palaces crumbled, temples fell into ruin, and the city of Alexandria shifted with the earth's movements. What was once a beacon of Hellenistic culture became a patchwork of ruins. In the medieval period, travelers to the city marveled at its fallen stones, but had no memory of Cleopatra's tomb. By then, she was no longer a queen to be sought, but a figure of legend. Her burial place a mystery already lost. In the modern imagination, however, the missing tomb transformed into a riddle, to be solved Archaeologists scoured sites across Egypt, tourists speculated, and writers imagined what might be found. Each failed expedition only added to the allure. Much as the hunt for Troy once fired the imagination of 19th century explorers. Yet there is an irony at work. The longer her tomb remains hidden, the more powerful it becomes as a symbol. Unlike Tutankhamun's burial chamber, which dazzled the world with gold, Cleopatra's absence invites endless projection. She is whatever the seeker desires: seductress, sovereign, martyr, or magician of politics. It is worth reflecting, too, on the possibility that the tomb may never be found. Archaeology is always a game of chance. Earthquakes, floods, urban construction, and centuries of looting mean that many graves are simply gone forever. Cleopatra's resting place may have been destroyed by natural disaster, dismantled for building material, or lost beneath miles of silt. If so, she is not just a queen without a tomb, but a reminder that history often ends in silence, its monuments erased by time. And yet, in a strange way, this very silence may be her greatest monument. Her death marked the end of pharaonic rule in Egypt, but her missing tomb ensures that she never fully enters the past. Each generation rediscovers her, not through stone and relics, but through stories, debates, and searches. She is alive in the act of pursuit. If archaeologists were to uncover her tomb tomorrow, the mystery would vanish, replaced by facts and artifacts. But while it remains missing, Cleopatra is eternal, an idea rather than a body. A queen who refuses to be contained by earth or sea. As you think about Cleopatra's story, you are left with the question that haunts historians and dreamers alike. Is the absence of her tomb a historical loss? Or is it precisely this absence that has preserved her power for 2 millennia? Perhaps her greatest act of defiance was not in how she lived, nor even in how she died, but in how she remains forever just beyond our grasp, a ruler whose grave is hidden, but whose memory refuses to fade. Few mysteries in history have captivated minds like the vanished tomb of Alexander the Great. Unlike most rulers, whose deaths marked the decline of their fame, Alexander's death in 323 BCE at the age of just 30 does seem to magnify his legend. He had conquered much of the known world, from Greece to Egypt, Persia, and as far east as India. Yet while his military campaigns are well documented, the fate of his remains, the final resting place of one of history's greatest conquerors, remains an enigma. Ancient accounts tell us that Alexander's body was treated with the reverence of a god. Upon his sudden death in Babylon, his corpse was reportedly placed in a golden sarcophagus, further encased in a gold casket and prepared for transport. His generals, however, quarreled over what should be done with it. Tradition dictated that a Macedonian king be buried in his homeland, but Egypt held a symbolic weight. It was in Egypt that Alexander had been declared the son of the god Ammon, and it was in Egypt that he had founded the great city of Alexandria, which bore his name. The body became a prize, not merely a relic of mourning, but a political object. Possession of Alexander's remains meant possession of his legacy. Initially, the funeral cortege was destined for Macedonia, but it was intercepted by Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals and the founder of the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. He diverted the body to Memphis, the ancient capital of Egypt, where it was first interred. Later, it was moved to Alexandria, the city Alexander himself had envisioned as a center of empire and culture. For centuries, the tomb in Alexandria was a site of pilgrimage. Writers such as Strabo and Plutarch describe how visitors, both rulers and common people, came to see the resting place of the great conqueror. Even Roman emperors traveled there. Julius Caesar, Augustus, and others reportedly paid their respects. Augustus himself is said to have gazed upon Alexander's mummified body, remarking in awe at its preservation. But after these accounts, the record becomes murkier. By the 3rd century CE, references to the tomb fade. Earthquakes, political upheavals, and the decline of Alexandria gradually erase memory of its precise location. Some scholars suggest it was destroyed by later Christian leaders, who sought to eliminate pagan relics. Others argue it simply vanished beneath centuries of urban growth, swallowed by the living city. By the medieval period, travelers no longer spoke of Alexander's tomb and all it had disappeared completely. Modern archaeologists and historians have launched countless theories about its fate. Some believe it still lies beneath Alexandria, buried under layers of buildings and streets. Others suggest it was removed, relocated, or dismantled entirely. A few more speculative theories even claim the tomb may be hidden outside of Egypt altogether, though no evidence supports this. Each excavation in Alexandria rekindles the hope that Alexander's final resting place will one day come to light. What makes the mystery even more tantalizing is the symbolic power of Alexander's missing body. He was a man who sought immortality through conquest, who demanded recognition as more than mortal, even as divine. That his tomb, once so magnificent, should vanish into obscurity seems almost poetic. A conqueror who ruled the world in life, yet who cannot be found in death. And so we are left with a tantalizing image, somewhere beneath the streets of Alexandria, perhaps under a bustling marketplace or a forgotten courtyard, may lie the golden sarcophagus of Alexander, the Great, hidden from human eyes for more than a millennium, or perhaps it has been lost forever, dissolved into dust, its grandeur erased by time. The question, of course, is what really happened to Alexander's tomb after the Roman emperors last gazed upon it? Was it destroyed deliberately, concealed intentionally, or does it still exist, awaiting discovery? When you begin to trace the fate of Alexander's tomb through the words of ancient writers, what strikes you most is how quickly something so monumental slipped into uncertainty. For nearly 6 centuries after his death, Alexander's grave was among the most famous in the ancient world. It drew emperors, poets, pilgrims, and philosophers. Yet the very sources that tell us this also set the stage for the mystery. The accounts are rich in reverence but poor in detail, filled with admiration but lacking in precise geography. They give us glimpses of processions and rituals, yet no reliable map of where exactly the tomb stood in Alexandria. Strabo, who visited Alexandria in the early 1st century BCE, described the tomb in broad terms, noting its grandeur and placement in the royal quarter. Later writers suggest that the structure was not a pyramid or a temple, but rather a mausoleum, richly decorated and continually maintained by the Ptolemies, who used it as both a dynastic symbol and a political tool. Coins and inscriptions even bore images of Alexander's burial, to reinforce the legitimacy of the ruling dynasty that claimed his memory. To stand before Alexander's body was to be reminded of the divine origins of Ptolemaic power. When Augustus visited the tomb after his conquest of Egypt in 30 BCE, the symbolism shifted. Rome had subdued the land that Alexander had once ruled, and Augustus wanted to associate himself with the conqueror. Plutarch records that Augustus gazed at the embalmed body and placed a golden crown upon it as a mark of honor. He reportedly snapped off a piece of Alexander's nose in the process, though this detail may be apocryphal. Still, the image lingers. The first emperor of Rome stooping before the dead Macedonian king, acknowledging the greatness of a man who had died nearly 3 centuries earlier. Other Roman leaders followed in Augustus' footsteps. Caligula is said to have stolen Alexander's breastplate from the tomb to wear himself, while Septimius Severus, ruling in the late 2nd century CE, ordered the tomb sealed to prevent further looting. Even then, Alexander's remains were considered objects of immense symbolic and mystical value. The body of the conqueror was more than a corpse, it was a relic of empire, a talisman of power. And then, curiously, silence. After the early 3rd century CE, references to the tomb vanished from the historical record. No late Roman or Byzantine writer describes visiting it. No pilgrim records its splendor. It is as though it ceased to exist, erased not only from the city's landscape but from its memory. Why did this happen? The answer may lie in the shifting tides of politics and religion. By the 4th century CE, Christianity had become the dominant faith of the Roman world. and pagan relics, especially those linked to divine kingship, were viewed with suspicion. Shrines, temples, and mausoleums once revered were dismantled, converted, or simply forgotten. Alexander, who had been celebrated as a god, may have become an uncomfortable figure in a Christianized empire that rejected such forms of worship. His tomb could have been desecrated, destroyed, or abandoned deliberately to strip it of its symbolic power. Earthquakes and tsunamis also reshaped Alexandria over the centuries, particularly in the 4th and 8th centuries CE. Entire quarters of the city collapsed into the sea, including palaces, harbors, and temples. If Alexander's tomb was located near the royal quarter on the shoreline, it might well lie beneath the Mediterranean today, buried under layers of stone and silt. Divers have uncovered submerged columns, sphinxes, and statues from that era, but no trace of the golden sarcophagus or the grand mausoleum has appeared. Other theories suggest a quieter fate. Some historians believe the tomb remained intact until the Arab conquest of Egypt in the 7th century CE, when it may have been dismantled for its treasures. Gold, silver, and jewels would not have remained untouched during centuries of shifting rule. Even if the sarcophagus had been preserved, it would have been a target for plunder. Its contents dispersed long before modern archaeologists could dream of recovering them. The most intriguing possibility, however, is that the tomb is still there, concealed beneath the streets of modern Alexandria. Archaeologists working in the city have uncovered hints of monumental structures, massive walls, underground chambers, and sections of the royal quarter. The city's dense modern construction makes excavation difficult, but the possibility lingers that beneath homes, shops, or even government buildings, the remains of Alexander's tomb still lie hidden. Yet despite centuries of searching, nothing definitive has been found, and each failed attempt deepens the riddle. How could the tomb of the most famous conqueror of antiquity vanish so completely? Was it destroyed beyond recognition, or is it simply waiting for the right discovery to bring it back into the light? The absence of Alexander's tomb has done something extraordinary. It has made him more than a historical figure. In death, he became a myth. And in the centuries since, the mystery of his missing grave has added to his immortality. When people today think of Alexander, they remember not only the campaigns that stretched from Macedonia to India, but also the tantalizing question of what became of him afterward. The silence surrounding his burial has become a story in itself, one that continues to echo in modern culture. One reason the mystery holds such weight is that Alexander deliberately crafted his own legend. During life, he styled himself as the son of a god, demanded recognition as divine, and encouraged stories that blurred the line between man and myth. His campaigns were marked by symbolism, visits to the oracle at Siwa, imitations of Achilles, the fusion of Greek and Persian traditions. He sought to transcend mortality, not only through conquest, but through ritual and image. A tomb, then, was not merely a resting place. It was supposed to be the physical anchor of his immortality, a shrine to his greatness. To have it vanish seems like a contradiction to his ambition. Yet perhaps it is also its fulfillment. His body no longer binds him to one place, and so his name belongs to the entire world. In modern Alexandria, the search for his tomb remains a matter of fascination. Archaeologists excavating beneath the city sometimes claim to have found clues, walls, chambers, foundations, but nothing conclusive. Proposals to expand the exploration beneath busy urban districts have often been rejected, leaving many to speculate that the tomb may never be uncovered. The city that Alexander founded is still thriving, built and rebuilt countless times, and beneath its streets the past remains layered like sediment, hard to disentangle. Beyond Alexandria, the mystery has inspired a host of imaginative theories. Some suggest that the tomb was relocated in antiquity, perhaps to protect it from looters or religious reformers. Others believe that what remains of Alexander's body may lie in an anonymous grave, stripped of its gold and treasures. Still others, far more speculative, argue that fragments of his tomb may have traveled to Europe or Asia through centuries of conquest and migration, yet without hard evidence. All such theories collapse into conjecture. What remains, then, is not a golden sarcophagus or a monumental chamber, but the idea of the tomb. Each generation projects its own desires onto Alexander's missing grave. For the Romans, it was a site of pilgrimage, a place to measure themselves against the greatest conqueror of the ancient world. For medieval chroniclers, the tomb became a fable of lost glory. For modern archaeologists, it represents the possibility of rewriting history with a single discovery. And for ordinary people, it remains one of those haunting questions. How could the resting place of a man who once ruled the known world simply vanish? Perhaps that is the most fitting conclusion. Alexander sought to escape mortality by inscribing his name across continents, and in a way, he succeeded. Unlike the pharaohs, whose mummies lie preserved in glass cases, Alexander cannot be reduced to a relic. His missing tomb resists the finality of closure. The mystery ensures that he is still spoken of not as a man of the past, but as a living legend, a story that refuses to end. As you reflect on this, you might wonder, if Alexander's tomb were to be discovered tomorrow, would it satisfy centuries of longing? Or would it strip away the very mystery that has kept him immortal in memory? Is it better that his grave remains hidden, leaving him forever more than human, more than king and eternal figure whose absence is itself a monument?